Today's presentations in our Get Growing webinar series is on container vegetable gardening. We've had a lot of requests for this topic in some of our evaluations, which is great to see. We also get this question a lot in our Master Gardener trainings and in some of our Master Gardener classes. As I reflected on this topic and started looking through some of the photos I have over the years, I've done a lot of container vegetable gardening. While I consistently try to maybe grow in the soil, as I'm a soil guy at heart, I do try to experiment in containers and do some troubleshooting and figure out what could work or maybe what doesn't work, or what is an epic failure or what works really well. So you will see a lot of photos from my own experience throughout today's presentation, those that I have been using previously, as well as some that I'm growing in this upcoming year as well in the growing season. My name is McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms extension educator, and I'll share a little bit more about myself on the next slide. These two photos you see here are from my own growing. The top left photo is a watermelon that I grew in a 5-gallon bucket about 3 summers ago, and I'll talk a little bit more about that one today. Currently in this growing season, I'm growing an heirloom tomato plant, Cherokee Purple, in this fabric bag container that you see in this bottom photo, right beside some raised beds that I built this summer. So this is my photo you see here. As shared with you, I'm a local foods and small farms educator, and I cover Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. I know there's a number of folks that are not in those counties that are joining us from around the state and potentially from other states. This is in northern Illinois. I'm right on the Wisconsin state line, and as well as one of our counties in Joe Davis touched Iowa State. My programming area is in soil management, soil health. I do a lot of work with commercial and non-commercial fruits and vegetable production. And what this really means is I work with homeowners, backyard growers, community gardens, but I also work a lot with farmers market vendors and so forth. I handle a lot of insect and disease questions and management. And for the last 4 years, I've been doing a lot in fruit tree pruning classes, especially with older and neglected apple trees that we have a lot of issues with in parts of northern Illinois. I am in planting zone 5B. And while I do not think too much of today's topic will necessarily be too impactful because of my planting zone, just recognize that we tend to have the last spring frost around mid-May. Most of us have started planting tomatoes in the last week. We've also started planting a lot of our squash plants this last week too, as well. So if you're not in our zone, you might be a little bit ahead of us perhaps, if you will. Today's plan is going to be the basics of container vegetable gardening. What are some things to think about when it comes to growing them in containers if you are going to do it this season and you have never done it before? What are some challenges you might run into, as well as why might you want to do this? What might be the purpose of growing them in a container? We'll get into some general practices when it comes to growing them, some of the spacing requirements, consideration of the depth of your container as well as the width of it. I'll focus a little bit on some crop profiles, some of the ones we consistently see as suggestions for growing in containers, as well as some of the problems we run into when it comes to also growing in them too. We'll get into container selection, as that's a very kind of pressing topic when it comes to container vegetable gardening, is picking and choosing the right container. Growing media is also another topic that's very relevant for container vegetable gardening and will mean that you have a pretty good season, or maybe you have a challenge with it. And finally, our last part will be on a bit of troubleshooting, including some of the questions we've gotten in the last couple of weeks from individuals who have registered for today's class. Container vegetable gardening is just as it sounds. You're growing vegetables and maybe your herbs, maybe your fruit in containers. So it's having no connection, no contact with the soil in your backyard or your raised bed or your growing area. You're growing completely in a different vessel. And what this usually means is you're using a non-soil growing media or a potting soil type mix. You're not going to be digging the soil out from the ground that you have and putting that into a container. It's just not going to work. You're actually going to be purchasing a bag or making your own kind of mix with different ingredients and using that to grow your vegetables and others in. One thing that is a benefit here is that it does allow you to utilize your spacing limits. If you are living now in an area where maybe you just have access to a patio, or maybe you no longer have that big garden that you want to grow in, container vegetables can allow you to still get those vegetables without the effort of having to grow in a different area. You can consistently kind of grow in a small container. It could also allow you to address problems in your growing area. If you have consistently run into compaction problems where the soil is just really poor, it doesn't drain well. If you are growing in an area where you have issues with shade, where yes, you've got 2 or 3 hours of sunlight in this one part of your area, but you have to consistently move it around or it doesn't perform well, maybe the container would be the advantage here. There's also some benefits sometimes in growing in a container if you have soil-borne diseases or you have consistent weed problems that could be addressed in a container. So it could allow you to kind of bridge that gap of still growing vegetables and yet not having to deal with those problems in your growing area. One of the great benefits with container vegetable gardening that we'll talk about today is that you can grow many different types of vegetables. You can be quite surprised what you can grow. When it comes to that traditional vegetable garden, we consistently see folks have good success growing most everything we would expect to grow in the garden in containers. Of course, with a couple of little intricate details and other things of management. Another thing that's really happening right now is that if you have visited any of the home and garden centers and nurseries the past couple of weeks and months, you would notice that there's a lot more container cultivars available to you than ever before, such as things that list bush and patio, and those that are really designed for a container based on their stature, based on their yield. You will find a lot more cultivars and varieties now, much more than you would have found maybe 5 or 10 years ago. What I also like when I grow container vegetables is that I can grow in different parts of my home and my backyard. I'm not just confined to having my vegetables in the raised beds in the backyard. I'll show you photos of how I've kind of spread it out, where, as my family says, you walk 4 feet and there's another vegetable that has shown up. That's how I do it, and that's how I like to do it. And it allows me to kind of have containers scattered throughout, which could be a great thing for landscaping, or maybe I've shot myself in the foot as of yet. I don't know. Another great thing, the ability to move them around during the growing season, especially if it's a container that really will need more sunlight, or you recognize that, okay, it's not growing well here. What if we move it over 10 feet and see if it does a little bit better? A lot of times when we think about container vegetable gardening, you might find it fits in well with your landscaping. I have a number of Swiss chard plants that are growing in containers right at the front of my door, and I have kind of tried to incorporate some really nice, beautiful colors in those containers. So as someone comes to my house, they can actually see those, and it fits in well, or at least I think it fits in well with my landscaping. Many of these can also allow you to reuse and recycle different containers. I'll show you some of the containers that I have upcycled, if you will, from previously planting some of my perennial shrubs this past growing season. One of the things that you should also think about is experiment. Try out different containers, see what things could work, what things don't work. Try different soil mixes and explore different cultivars and varieties. If you're not yet ready to jump right in with growing maybe a squash in your growing area, maybe you might try it out in a container just to see what that plant is like and how it works. Containers allow for experimentation, filling up a container, putting in a plant, seeing how it performs, and maybe it works really well is less of a risk than maybe planting 10 or 15 of that cultivar and variety in your backyard area, and you're not happy with it, whether it's the way the plant grows or even the flavor of it. A question we will sometimes get though is what is the difference between a container versus a raised bed? Because yes, you're growing above the soil surface in a raised bed and it is a container, right? You're putting stuff into it. You're putting soil into it in the soil mix. The main difference here is that a raised bed is consistently going to be on the soil surface. So if you are growing in a very big container and it's not allowing for drainage or it's not coming into contact with the soil, almost by definition, you would think of that as a container because it's not going to allow for any kind of contact with that soil where it could break down and it could enter into that soil cycle and you would have soil biological activity. In a lot of times with a raised bed, especially, it's a much greater area than that container. It's just going to be much more massive when it comes to growing. And really, it's almost as if instead of having the vegetable garden a certain width and length, you're growing in this raised bed for a reason. It does also stay in place for years, and it is interacting with your soil. The photo you see here is one of my raised beds this past year that we have yet to fill up. Or we've already filled it up. This is just a little bit earlier. And a lot of times, especially in a raised bed, you're adding a soil mix that's similar to your soil. So it is something that is not going to be removed on a yearly basis. In most cases, which we'll talk about today with container vegetable gardening, you are replacing that mixture every year versus a raised bed where you're not doing that. You're going to have just a consistent kind of mixture of soil in it, and then you maybe are adding and trying to replicate the soil with it. It usually also has better drainage than container because it is coming into contact with that soil bed and allowing for some replication of that soil. As you think of this, if you're growing in a big container that you cannot move, you may find that the reason that your vegetables have not performed for you well is because you're using potentially a raised bed mix where it's never coming into contact with the soil. And so you may actually need to remove that and actually put in potentially a lot of container mix in there. More about this as we go along today. The challenges with container vegetable gardenings can be quite long, though. We need to recognize that, compared to sometimes planting an annual ornamental that, can consistently yield, maybe is able to work really well for you. Sometimes these vegetables are really limited by your container size. When you think of what to grow and how much you can put into a single plant, still go back to that seed packet, still go back to what the spacing width is between the plants that you're going to grow, because that can still give you some clarity as far as if this container is going to be the right size or if it's not going to be the right size and it needs more space. It may really require troubleshooting, and we'll talk about some of the issues we've run into with container vegetable gardening at the end today for some of these things that you might start to see this season. Some of which might be in your control that season, some of which may be that you just have to start over. We encourage using new growing media every year, and we'll talk more about the reason for this, but just know that that can sometimes be the main expense, is that you need to consistently change out that growing media so that the plants are really able to grow and really able to thrive. If you've had poor performance in previous years, recognize that it could be your growing media that's the main issue. You're also not digging up the soil and putting it into that container. It's not going to do what you expect it to do. Recognize too that even when you've got everything in place as far as the watering, the fertility, fertilizer, the soil media, yields may still be lower. That's something to kind of recognize, is that you may not have that consistent yields from a plant that was grown in the soil versus one in a container. I also think you should recognize that you may not be able to grow the variety you want. That if you're growing something that you love and you think maybe this could grow in a container, you may just find it doesn't perform well for you, even when doing everything right, if you will. Some of the main challenges, especially with container vegetable gardening, is that drainage can be an issue. you may find that your containers are just not draining as well as they should. And a lot of your plants are really being waterlogged and not consistently performing with it. I think it's also important to recognize that you may not be able to fully provide all of that your family needs or expect to need during that growing season. Containers are, as they say, a very smallish container. And so most of these can be designed for maybe 1 to 2 plants, depending, of course, on what you're growing. Sometimes the other issue you run into is nutritional issues because you are growing in a potting mix or you're growing in what we call a soilless growing media mix. There's not nitrogen in there. There's not phosphorus. There's not potassium. There's not all of these other plant foods that are needed. And so you may encounter that you need to address their nutrient issues. Because they also may be draining more consistently, you may need to add more fertilizer here too. And sometimes plants are just not able to adapt. They're not happy, mark it up yet again to experiment with it. Sometimes these containers can also increase the soil temperatures. They can increase it a little bit too much, more than we would like during the growing season. And the roots can be kind of cooked, if you will, as they're growing. This can be good and bad, recognize that, but there can be some challenge here where the performance of your plants is based on that container where it's just getting too hot in that growing season. What vegetables can you really grow when it comes to a container vegetable gardening? I always try to be pretty positive here and say, most can adapt if they're given that right size container, really the right amount of sunlight, that good drainage and fertility that we're after. In most cases, we're looking at about 6 to 8 inches in depth. So as you think about the containers you currently have and thinking about, okay, what is the actual depth of that container? Typically, you can get away with 6 to 8 inches, although I would push more towards 8 if you can, depending on what your growing thing is. Now, there are certainly short-rooted vegetables where we could go at about 6 inches. If we think about a lettuce or a radish or some of those smaller ones, spinach, you might be able to get away with 6 inches here with it. If you were trying to grow carrots or maybe some of those very deep-rooted vegetables, look towards going 2 inches past expected length. So if it is a carrot that's expected to be 8 to 10 inches in length, you may be looking at a container that's about 12 inches in depth for it. In most cases, the bigger container is going to be better. As big as you can sometimes get it, or as big as you feel comfortable with, you're going to have more success because it can allow for the plant to really move around, or rather not move around, but put its roots around and really grow pretty well for you. Recognize too that the recommendations on spacing and size vary, and they vary even within other universities' extension systems. As I looked through some of the documents I had this week, Minnesota recommends one thing, Illinois recommends another thing, Iowa recommends another thing when it comes to spacing and the actual size of your container. So it's wildly inconsistent, and that's unfortunately where we're at. I've tried to utilize mostly Illinois extension recommendations at this point. What vegetables to grow continued then? Look to start at 1 gallon. You're going to find most consistently a pot or a planter that is about a 1 gallon in volume, dry volume here, can work pretty well for you. And we'll go more into detail as we go along today with this. As you get up to that 5 gallon size, you will find that this may be where a single heirloom tomato plant fits in and where it will perform well for you, or a squash plant. You may even find that up to a 5 gallon size could allow you to grow lots of different vegetables in that container because you have enough room to space it around. You see in this photo, this is one of my heirloom tomato plants, Cherokee Purple. This is a 10 gallon size fabric bag. So as it's planted, I pretty much could just get away with 1 in here. But if I was planting other types of vegetables, I could probably get away with a lot more vegetables because it is this 10 gallon pot size that really allows for drainage and really allows for good airflow. Another recommendation too, kind of a base start would be 2-gallon with about an 8 to 9 inch diameter. This would allow you to potentially really grow lots of different vegetables with it. As such, can you go smaller? Yes, you could go smaller for some of these, especially if it was a very short-rooted vegetable, such as spinach, lettuce, parsley, some of those herbs, you might be able to get away with it. Yet again, looking back more as far as what the actual spacing might be in a single vegetable garden. Do you need to fill it up? Do you need to fill up your container? Not always. If you're hitting that diameter, or rather the depth that you need, where you're getting 8 to 10 inches in depth, you may find that you don't need to fill it up completely. The fabric bag that you see here is 14.5 inches depth. So I do need to fill it up. I think it's settled the last week since planting, so I do need to fill it up a little bit more. But yet again, if it's a vegetable we know has pretty shallow roots, such as a lettuce or spinach, you could probably get away with some of those smaller pots out there. Here are some recommendations. And yet again, as I share with you, every state's a little bit all over the place when it comes to what they recommend. What I've tried to do is break these up by gallons, so gallon volume, if you will, of dry ingredient, dry growing media. And then I've also included something about diameter. And yet again, these are just some recommendations. You will see some guides that will say, a 1-gallon pot, you could get all of this in here. So you can see 1 gallon, 6 to 7 inches in diameter. This includes 2 to 3 potentially green beans spaced accordingly in that area. Leaf lettuce, 4 to 6. Spinach, about 1 inch apart. Swiss chard, gosh, you could probably just get about 1 Swiss chard in there. Depends, of course, on that cultivar. For the 2 to 3 gallon pot, 8 to 9 inches in diameter, we hope. Beets, about 2 to 3 inches. Carrots, 2 to 3 inches scattered around. Yet again, back to the actual depth of that pot, you may need to go a little bit further. Cabbage could potentially be placed in a 2 to 3 gallon one. At least just one of those. Cucumbers, you could do about 2. Still want to think about what the size of those cucumber plants are going to be. For 3 gallon, this would be with a 12-inch diameter. Determinate, cherry, patio tomatoes, we really are looking at probably about one of these in a single kind of 3 gallon growing area and pot. 5 gallon, probably 12-inch diameter is indeterminate tomatoes. These, yet again, are just some guidance here as far as what some of the recommendations are, and some of what we kind of see could work pretty well for you. You may find that you could play around with this though. I like to look at other vegetables. So yes, that's great guidance, but what else could I maybe grow? What else could I do? Potatoes are one where we have a lot of these kind of grow bags on the market, and you see these pretty consistently that work pretty well for a lot of folks. The benefit with these is that if it allows you to kind of hill up and move the sides of the bags, that can work well. They usually will allow for pretty good drainage here too. It's really important, especially as that potato is growing, to just don't fill the entire container at planting. About 6 to 7 inches in height is when you really want to start hilling up your potatoes with it. This is also one where it could help address Colorado potato beetle if you've run into some problems with that insect, because you can actually move these bags around. That's a benefit here with these. It is a walking insect, Colorado potato beetle is. You may find that yields would be limited based on the size though. And I think that's something to kind of think about when it comes to your spacing. As far as the size, I would probably push it more towards the 5 gallon kind of volume area if you can. And I would also pry them to about maybe 10 to 12 inches, maybe a little bit less than that, depending on what type you're growing. I have tried in some years to grow melons and grow pumpkins in 5 gallon buckets, which you see here, based on volume. It's still really important to recognize that the vines are going to need their space. And it could be that this works pretty well. You might be able to actually get away with this in some of your buckets is to have the vines and other things cascading. Yet again, if we're thinking of, what size that might look like, I would probably start out with about a 3-gallon volume type of growing area. And that might just be a single plant where the vines are kind of cascading over the sides of it. This may also be one where you really need to move around that planter, and you may need to provide a trellis for this system as well. Perennial vegetables such as rhubarb, asparagus, we don't tend to see them in containers, especially the traditional containers we think of with vegetables. I think because they're going to have to overwinter and make it through kind of our harsher winters that we see in our planting zones, it could be pretty difficult to do. If you have had pretty good success in the container with those, I'd love to hear about it though. But I just think because of that container, it may have some challenges with it. The same could be true for fall planted garlic, where you're planting in mid-October or the first week of October, and you may find that it doesn't really work for you when it comes to that container, as it's going to have to overwinter. You would also find you may be a little bit limited as far as how much garlic you could actually grow kind of in that area as well too. If you're looking for better success with sweet potatoes, especially in our growing area, this is where a container would work really well. I have grown sweet potatoes in containers off and on for the last 10 years and been very pleased with them, pleased with the success of them. And you probably have noticed this too if you have grown any ornamental sweet potato vines as well. The vines just really take off when it comes to growing in a container. So the benefit here is that container should usually warm the growing media up and allow it to get much hotter in June when we really need to have that sweet potato thriving and really growing. So this would be one to actually consider as a good container option. There's some guidance out there as far as spacing when it comes to them. You might start off with a good 5-gallon size kind of fabric bag with it too, which would warm it up. I have also used kind of basic black plastic planters, and I've also have combined this with plastic, kind of a clear plastic on the top of my growing area to warm that soil up even more. But they really work pretty well with this. And it is important to recognize that, make sure that the drainage is addressed. Typically, sweet potatoes in Northern Illinois are planted the first week of June. So the next week or two would be a great time to get the slips, gather kind of everything that you need and grow them. And I think you may find some really good success with it growing in a container. I've listed a number of different cultivars and varieties that have been recommended as far as eggplant, pepper, and tomato in containers. I have grown very small eggplants in 5-gallon buckets. In this photo, this is Fairy Tale. It's a very small eggplant. It's about the length of my index finger. Grows really well, thrives really well in containers. You see a lot of flowers at the top of that eggplant. So it's really designed for the patio and really, designed for containers. Peppers, you'll find options that maybe are bell pepper related, but you also see a term such as lunch box. Lunchbox is a very consistent one and a consistent performer in the containers, and very small yet again when it comes to the pepper size. For your tomatoes, this is where you might steer more towards a bush type. A bush type of tomato is going to be a little bit smaller, a little bit more consistent when it comes to the yield of it and the growth of it. You will also see the term patio used a lot if you're going to any home and garden centers, and that would be time where you might actually look to use those in containers too, as they would perform pretty well and have a good stature to them. The tomato area is one where we see a lot of folks experiment with. I have had some years where I've tried growing indeterminate or what we call heirloom tomato plants in the 5-gallon bucket system and had okay performance. It's not yielded as well as I would have liked. Uh, there are some recommendations from other folks that will do a 3-gallon volume type area to grow their tomatoes and have really good success with them too. It's one where the yields just may be a little bit lower if you are moving some of these over into containers. But I think this is one where you could experiment with. As you can imagine, you're going to have to provide some trellising or some kind of support for your tomato. But if your family just needs 1 or 2 tomatoes for that season, this might be a good compromise instead of putting out so many plants. Your squash family, you're going to see bush, baby, and patio pretty often. And those would all be pretty good choices when it comes to selecting any of kind of those cultivars that might grow pretty well in containers. You still may want to address the trellis and the vine, and that may be especially true if you are growing any type of these plants where if you have one container and you're growing more than one of these squash family members, this might be where you provide some support and trellis so that they have a better ability to kind of move their roots around and develop really well. I find also too, when I have grown some of the squash, that I need to move it around. I think that it's just something that, especially as some of these vines I've tried to grow previously, they tend to start to spread everywhere. They tend to kind of limit some of my mowing and what I could do when it comes to mowing my grass. So I have to move them around, especially these larger vine apparatuses. But by sticking with something like a bush, baby, or patio, this should ensure that you have a very smaller, compact plant with its vine. You'll see a lot of different cucumber cultivars, which will be things such as patio, yet again, or bush, salad bush. Muncher is one that has been recommended too. I currently have muncher planted in my vegetable garden. Mexican sour gherkin is the one that you see here in this photo. So a very small cucumber. And that may be what you think of, as you think of what cultivar variety might work really well in a container, it could very much be some of those smaller ones. I'm not growing the big Atlantic giant pumpkin, if you will, in a container. I just don't think it's going to work well for you. For zucchini, Pick and Pick is one, Zucchini Elite, Patio Star, Gold Rush, Sunburst, all of those would perform pretty well for you in containers. As always, you've got to match the container with the plant. So you may find that as you think of how big your zucchini traditionally gets, this might be where you decide to go something a little bit smaller in that container. I try to also play around with my container vegetable gardening. So while I am growing in the soil, while I also am growing in my vegetables in containers, I'm also thinking of, okay, how could I use these containers in a different way? How might I be able to actually utilize them to address insects or address bringing pollinators to my garden? One of the great opportunities here is that you could do companion planting in your containers. And the ones that are listed here are those meant to deter insects from being a problem. So repelling insects away from the main plants that you are growing. They could be in that container, or you could have them in a big pot or container around the perimeter of your garden or in between the rows of your growing area. So it could act as kind of a fence, if you will, of containers that maybe could help repel some of those insects away. Thyme, nasturtium, onion have been recommended for broccoli, cabbage, and lettuce. Marigold has been recommended for zucchini. Basil and thyme are two that have been recommended for tomato. I'll send out a resource today that has more overview of these as far as choosing certain companion plants to help with insect control. One of the other things I try to do when I grow squash is to actually plant buckwheat. Buckwheat is a cover crop that will typically work to attract more pollinators to your garden. And buckwheat is notorious for going to seed really fast in your growing area. But if you were to grow buckwheat in a container, it's already contained. So it already is kind of in its own little planting zone. And you don't have to worry always too much about maintaining it. because it goes so fast, grows so fast, and goes to seed pretty fast too. And it's one that I will typically, if I'm planting pumpkins or squash or anything in that family, I will try to put out some buckwheat in a container because it can be more confined there. I could also move it around if need be, and I can maintain it much easier. Another option for containers would be some trap cropping. If you've been on some of my previous webinars, I've talked a lot about trap cropping as a way to basically trap some of those main insects from getting to the main crop that you're growing. So you're growing this plant as a sacrifice, if you will, in the hopes that all of your insect pests, or certain ones, will go towards this one. Blue Hubbard is one that I currently have in a container. So it was started a couple weeks ago before my main squash. And I'm hoping by having it kind of isolated in one part of my growing area that it might help quite a bit with addressing squash bugs. Time will tell as the season goes along. Marigolds are also ones that you might look at doing as a kind of trap crop in a container because they tend to attract Japanese beetles. As you just saw, I did recommend marigolds for companion plants for zucchini. So that's something where you're going to have to recognize that Japanese beetles love marigolds, and it could be great for addressing an insect pest on your zucchini, but it could also cause you some problems that season. You still also always have to manage this trap crop. So it could be that you're spraying a pesticide on them once they have been on this trap crop, but it could also reduce your pesticide use if you go down that route, for instance. There's a lot of guides out there that would talk about placing them at the border of your growing area, but a container plant would work really well for these too. So let's talk about these containers then. You're just going to encounter lots of different types of containers out there. These will be plastic. These are ones we usually see a lot of at home and garden centers. You will see fabric ones, you will see wood, metal, you'll see terracotta, you'll have those ceramic ones available to you as well. It's really important in thinking about what might be the right selection and the right container is to think about that diameter of the top of that container, look at the height or the actual depth, and then do some calculations to figure out that volume. There's a number of websites where you can take the diameter and the width and actually figure out how much volume you're getting in that container. And you might be really surprised as far as how much volume some of these containers can consistently hold. We are very used to a 5-gallon bucket, which is what you see here. So if I was to fill up that fully, we're talking about a 5-gallon situation here. Recognize that some of your containers may just be a single plant. That may just be where you're at. That, as I look at my container here from a couple seasons ago, I really couldn't get another pepper plant in there. There's just really no way for another plant to get everything it needs without them competing against one another. The right container really may make or break your experience. And that may be if you've addressed some of your other issues in that growing season or from previously, that might be where you need to kind of think about, okay, can I get a bigger container to help with this? Some additional things to think about here. You may need to fill it up completely, especially if it is a container where it's right on the cusp of that maybe 6 to 8 inches in length. So it needs to really go up a little bit more to be full there. Recognize that small containers tend to dry out quicker than the other ones. That's pretty consistent when it comes to some of the containers that you're using. Yeah, again, this could be addressed based on your growing media, which we'll talk some about more. Look to go big if you can, but also recognize that the bigger you go, it may be more difficult to move that container. It may be very hard to move it around if you need to move that around. I always try to think about, use what you have and ensure drainage is addressed. If you have a lot of different containers, matching them up with the right vegetable that you're going to grow is crucial here. If you have some of those old kind of rubber tubs or Rubbermaid tubs, plastic tubs, utilizing them could be great, but still recognize that you're going to have to address drainage. And that can be through the growing media, but also ensuring that you have enough holes in there. So I went walking around my house just to look at the different containers that I have and some of the ones that I use. This season, we have just planted some rose bushes, and you will actually see the three that are here. We're reusing some pots from the previous season. Currently, I've got some very small, I believe I've got two different cucumbers that are growing here, very small cucumbers. The 2 gallon is a standard one, which you see here on the left, and then the 1 gallon is the one you see on the right. I took out my ruler and did some measurements for these, so you can kind of see that the 2 gallon is about 8.5 inches in diameter from growing from side to side as far as its growing area. And then about 1 gallon is about 7.5 inches in diameter, about 6.5 in actual depth to it. These are ones where, obviously I could place these in more decorative pots. It is one though that I should be cleaning these thoroughly before planting. And you may find that you have a lot of these that could be reutilized, and they're already in a good standard size that we typically expect with them. But certainly this 2 gallon one might be a little bit better for maybe my beets, my carrot, and might be able to get away with maybe one pepper in it. When it comes to the 1 gallon, green beans, lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard could potentially be planted in here. Yet again, based on the spacing of it is really what you're after. The challenge being that the depth of the 1 gallon pot is just maybe a little bit too low than what we'd like. I've shifted some of my planting over to fabric bags, and these are usually made from a kind of a plant, or rather a felt material. One of the things that you will also find is that these are usually pretty affordable. You will find sometimes some really good deals for getting, 5 of these for sometimes $15 to $20. So it can really be an affordable thing to do. The challenge is that because of some of their gallon type size, it can be a lot of growing media that goes in here. The one that you see here is a 10-gallon fabric bag. I measured it before we got started today, and it is about 14.5 inches in actual diameter, and about 14 inches in actual depth. So you'll note that that tomato does need to be raised up more. It's just a little bit too close, and the soil that I was using in there had settled quite a bit. One of the great things is it does work really well for drainage. If you've struggled with drainage, it works really well with it. It also could be easy to move around, as most of these will have handles on them. And if they don't have handles on them, I probably wouldn't buy them, because I think it's really nice to be able to move your plants around if need be. And it really depends on the plant you want to grow. A fabric bag like this that's fully full, if you will, would work pretty well for kind of growing my own little mini garden. I could grow a lot of different vegetables in here based on my spacing and so forth with them. I also have potatoes currently grown in one of the bags, and I've tried to roll down the sides here. This is a purple potato, so it is a fingerling potato. I still need to go through and remove a couple of the plants because I just had some extra and just wanted to throw them out and see what happens. And so the spacing isn't there where it needs to be, but it is a fingerling potato, so I'm not expecting the plant to get too big necessarily. But it would allow me to really roll up the sides. And if you have had issues with drainage and growing in some of your containers, potatoes and other root vegetables, this might be where the advantage is, especially in this hilling up process that you will need to do for potatoes. One of my pots up front, one of my planters, this is one of my decorative planters. I believe it is about 5 gallons in size. I'm currently using it as kind of my landscape as you come in. And so I've tried to space my Swiss chard based on its actual spacing depth, and making sure that the plants are getting kind of the spacing that you need. So you see I've got about 3 Swiss chard that are in this plant. I also have thyme that's planted in the middle of it. What I've found, especially with some of the decorative planters, is they have very poor drainage. And that's what I have encountered, especially with some of the record rainfalls that my county has been consistently having. They're filling up really fast. And I don't necessarily know if I'm going to have the best success with them based on kind of what I'm encountering here with it. And that's what you may run into with some of those decorative planters, is that you just want to grow them in an entirely different apparatus and place them into these planters here. You may also have some indoor planters lying around, and some of these might be a bit more decorative for you. Just recognize that some of these may be just better suited for non-vegetables. A lot of these planters, especially if you were to put the growing media into the actual planter, you may not even have any drainage holes, or it may have very poor drainage to begin with. So as much as it would visually look really great to have a basil plant or a thyme plant in here, and yes, I could potentially grow it indoors, it may just not have the drainage that you need here. And also the depth may be there, but the width may not be there as well. So keep that in mind, that sometimes those indoor planters are really designed more for plants that do not need always consistent watering, nor do they need a lot of fertility sometimes too. They're really designed more for your succulents, for your cacti, for some of those other indoor ones that are just not expecting to have good drainage with them. The 5-gallon bucket is a container that I've used pretty consistently. It tends to be about around 11 inches in width. And as you can imagine, the depth of these can be really nice as well too. So you could consistently be getting some of your root vegetables planted in here as well. They also tend to be fairly inexpensive, which is nice, easily purchased, and also pretty easy to adapt. It's very easy to drill holes in the bottom of your 5-gallon bucket, which you have to do, compared to drilling holes in a decorative planter or some of the other ones that are out there. This one's pretty good with it. It does need to be stored indoors in the winter. You know, I have had some times where I've forgotten about my containers being outdoors, and because of the winter that we encounter with kind of the thawing and snow and the freezing temperatures, it cracks them, it breaks them up. They are just not designed to be planters that stay outdoors consistently. That's just what we really kind of encounter with these. The other thing you'll note here, you know, this is my first season growing them, growing my watermelon in this one, and it's way too. I needed to raise my growing media up higher. I need to actually have more soil in there, because the plant is just hanging out too low on the ground. So I have found that as I have grown more watermelon previously or following this, that I need to have this one be pretty full. The plant looks great. It looks really great right now. But the challenge was that it just wasn't deep enough. The depth just wasn't there enough. But the benefit can be that you can move it around easily. I've grown tomatoes, peppers in 5 gallons, and been very happy with them. The watermelon just did not perform well and didn't really yield well for me that season whatsoever. I have grown sometimes my potatoes in them and tried to grow them, and found that even with enough drainage holes in there, they just don't drain enough. So I would steer more towards some of the other ones. But yet again, you know, let's see what the diameter of that 5-gallon is, and the actual depth of it, and you're in a pretty good place when it comes to using some of these. You'll always find plastic planters, and you may find you have a lot of these left over from previous seasons. That's what I kind of encountered as I kind of looked around to see what I had and could use. They tend to also be pretty easy to clean, and they usually offer a lot of good drainage in most cases. The challenge is going to be the width of that, or rather that diameter of your planter, as well as the height. You know, you're not going to be able to grow as many vegetables in some of these smaller ones. So the ones that you see here, I've got about a height of about 7 inches on the left. Then I have about a height on the right of about 6 inches here on the right rather, for both of these planters. So they're pretty small planters. I could still grow, potentially I could put maybe some loose leaf lettuce in here. I might be able to put some spinach, maybe a single herb might go in these plants. I'm probably not going to expect to put my other things like eggplant or tomatoes or so forth in there. So following up the previous photo, you can actually see the diameter of these planters. So the one on the left is about 7.5 inches, and we see about 8 inches on the one on the right. And that's a bit of the challenge, is that you may have a planter where the depth is great, it works great for you, but the width and the diameter may not be where it needs to be. So it could limit you. The same with the one on the right there, that, okay, it's a good 8 inches. I could space maybe 1 or 2 green bean plants in here and see how things go. I might be able to space out some of my loose leaf lettuce for a single herb in this situation. So what I encourage you to do really is take out the ruler. Start measuring the diameter of the pots that you might be using or the planters you're using, and then also factor in, what's the actual depth. And as you can imagine there too, as these photos have shown you, I'm not taking a measurement from the center of that plant, I'm taking it from the side of the plant. And all of these planters are really designed to have more of that kind of V shape towards the base. So as much as these have an 8-inch diameter, I'm really not going to be able to get that consistent planting depth in that entire planter, if that makes sense. I really am limited based on almost being the center of the plant with it. So some additional thoughts on containers. There's just many different types out there. Some of the ones that I've shown you today, you may have used this summer or previous used and had some other challenges with growing them too. In this photo you see from Oregon State, there's a lot of those very long, narrow, square planters that have a good, consistent length to them and a consistent width to them as well. And that can allow you to have a more, yet again, consistent planting here too. Sometimes you might want to consider avoiding anything with metal or dark color. And the reason for this is that it can absorb too much heat and certainly harm some of the roots as they develop. Some plants love this. They're happy with really hot soil and very happy with, allowing for them to absorb nutrients and so forth. But some are just not happy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. If you are going to make your own, you have leftover plastic containers and materials, look to focus on diameter, depth, and also just really ensure that you've added enough drainage holes. Typically a good 8 to 10 holes is what you're after. The diameter of those holes can be there's different criteria out there for how big these should be, but certainly it's something that you need to consider. I always usually share, do 8 to 10 and do an additional one just to see. And most of the time, these holes need to be at the bottom of that planter. I wouldn't worry too much about putting them at the side, as you may find some inconsistencies when it comes to drainage that way. There's also other containers that are described as more self-watering or kind of these grow box situations. And you see here on the left from Texas A&M, there's a lot of these DIY designs out there. The benefit to these is that it could really allow for consistent moisture in your growing area and in your container, as that tends to be a bit of the struggle that we run into with containers is inconsistent moisture. And most of the ones that are really out there, whether they are ones that you are making your own, they tend to have a bit of this kind of a drainage pipe, this white drainage pipe, which you see here, that allows you to water below it. But really what these are acting as is that they have a divider between your actual container and kind of a reservoir of water at the base. And then typically you're still going to need to water. It's just that it allows for more consistent watering to occur with this. You see in this design here on the left that they have kind of utilized a plastic bin, and they're able to grow lots of different mixtures within it. You also see they have a bit of a divide there between the actual reservoir of the water that is being added with that white PVC pipe and the actual soil that's kind of being grown there too. On the left, or rather on the right here, you'll see kind of a similar design with a 5-gallon bucket where they have a kind of a barrier in between the reservoir of the water as well as the actual pot that you would be growing into or filling up, if you will, with it. So it does take a little bit of a hydroponics type of situation here too with it. But this could be an interesting project to play with this summer, especially when it comes to maybe some watering issues that you run into. I will send you some links to this one as well to help with it. I know that some of our master gardeners in some counties have done these and built these and been pretty happy with the way they perform. Here's where we get to growing media. And when we're talking about growing media, we're talking about what you're actually going to be growing your vegetables in. And this is where we have to recommend that new growing media should be used every year. So if you are planning to use the same growing media from the previous season, just know that using it this year, you're going to run into some issues. And the reason for this is that you are not growing in the soil. If you were to grow into the soil, you would not be removing the soil. You would be adding to the soil, adding compost and so forth. And the soil would be naturally draining. The soil would be helping when it comes to addressing aeration. That soil would have a nitrogen cycle that's really nice and allows for nitrogen to be taken up by the plant and other fertilizers and fertility. When you're growing in the container, you don't have that. So you're using a mix that typically has no soil whatsoever. We call it a soilless growing media. And you could do two things. You could purchase your own, and this would be something where it could be a container mix that has the ingredients you need for it. Or you could also be making your own, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But both of these things could be your options, and you need to add new growing media and replace the growing media each year. If you are removing this growing media from the previous year, this could be dumped in your growing area or somewhere else. But just know that we recommend this, and you're going to have much better success when it comes to using and growing vegetables in containers by replacing your growing media each year. And yet again, avoid using your own soil. Yes, there are some recipes out there for doing it, but you could run into some issues there, especially when it comes to drainage and compaction problems. A lot of times when you look at your kind of potting soil mix or growing mix media, you'll see things such as peat moss, coconut coir, which is from the processing of coconuts, perlite, vermiculite. Those are very much consistent ingredients. Vermiculite, something that acts as a sponge and helps with the moisture and hold moisture in. Perlite tends to help address more aeration, although it will also allow for some water uptake as well. Compost might be included. You may find sand, and you may also have some fertilizers listed in here as well. When I looked at my growing media mix that I have for my containers, this is what you see here on the right. So you see there are some white particles, which is going to be your perlite. You also will have vermiculite mixed in there. There's some compost, there's some coconut coir, just some lots of different ingredients that are really designed to allow for good drainage and for good moisture retention of your containers. And that's why you need new one every year, because if I am using this every single year, the perlite, the vermiculite, all of those things that are helping to address drainage, helping to address water uptake are being depleted, are being used. You also have a root system of your container vegetables that's going in there and taking out some of those ingredients. So that's why you need to consistently have new growing media every year, is because these ingredients are really being depleted, or they are just not in the right shape to really perform for you. I got ahead of myself a little bit here too, but just recognize the nutrients that were in that growing media, if it had a fertilizer, have been taken up by the plant. All of those roots have also impacted the porosity of the space and in that container there too. And then yes, the water has been held by the perlite and vermiculite, really is no longer usable in this situation. You may have run into some growing issues if using last year's. This could be poor drainage, it could be poor plant vigor, where the plant just doesn't really thrive, it's just not too happy when it comes to it. You could also run into some fertility issues where the plant is yet again not getting the nutrients that it needs because there was no longer nutrients in that growing media. I know I'm going to get this question, could you still use last year's? You might be able to get away with it, but you're going to have to purchase and put in new ingredients. So while you might be able to use that same base that you had previously used, you're going to need to add vermiculite, you're going to need to add perlite. We would encourage you to add compost, and you might also still not have the success you're after. So it may not actually save you much money by going out there and bringing in some of these ingredients in that standard growing mix that you're going to be using. And it's just, we don't have much guidance for that area either. So to show you a couple of photos, so from my growing medium mix, you see here in this top photo, it is listed for flowers, vegetables, and herbs. It's also listed for outdoor containers. So both of those things were crucial. If I'm going to be growing in containers, I want to at least make sure that, that these will work pretty well for my flowers and vegetables, particularly vegetables that I'm going to be growing with it. When I turn the back of the label, you see my ingredients listed here. This is things like peat, humus, compost, sphagnum peat moss, perlite was one that was listed here too. So a lot of those kind of expected ingredients in here, along with even some limestone. Because this is really designed to go into a pot or a planter, it's not going to necessarily have those ingredients that we might need for the soil. It's really focusing on making sure that the roots can get the aeration they need. The roots can also ensure that they are getting and finding any fertilizers that you might be applying, and making sure that moisture is staying within it. You may also find that sometimes the bag will mention how many pots you should expect to fill. One of the other things that you might encounter is actual nutrients in the soil, or rather in this growing mix. And you see here that same growing mix I've been using, it has some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in here. But as a soil person, I will tell you that is nothing. That is such a small amount that you're going to have to add a fertilizer. You're going to have to add something else. You may find something much greater in your growing mix. You could find that your growing mix is a 10-10-10 or a 5-5-5. But because this mix is so small, it really is barely going to give me much nutrients during that growing season. And that could be where you ran into some struggles, is that you expected your growing mix to have all the fertilizer that your vegetables needed. But when you actually look at the fertility on there, it's nothing. It's just very, very minimal, if anything. Some additional things to recognize. Soilless growing mixes that you will use in containers dry out quickly. They can also be quite expensive, and yet we still try to recommend having that new growing media every year. And you're going to need to add fertilizers. I have realized I have to add fertilizers for all of my vegetables if I'm using this growing mix, which is what I am doing. You could make your own. You could get a lot of different ingredients and find good recipes out there. This is usually combining an organic matter like a compost, and then you're adding vermiculite or perlite or sphagnum peat moss. And some of these will be a 1-to-1, for instance. So 1 part compost, 1 part vermiculite, 1 part perlite, or so forth. And you could also add your own fertilizer at this stage too. Recognize that container vegetables dry out very quickly. It is not beyond the norm for you to expect sometimes to water your container vegetables every single day. You may find that you need to do this, and especially if you have a rain gauge nearby and you're watching water, the rainfall. If you're putting your finger around where the edges are and they feel very dry, they just dry out very quickly, and you may need to water every single day. It's very important to don't allow the soil media to dry completely. It's very hard to reinvigorate, if you will, very dry soil media. It's much easier just to kind of keep it consistently wet there. How much water then? How much amount should be watering your plants? Typically until that soil ball or that kind of growing area is moist, or when water is really running through your holes. That's kind of what you're after here. Most are also going to need full sun, any kind of containers that you're after. You may get away with a little bit of partial shade when it comes to your lettuces and spinach and so forth. But for a lot of our fruit-bearing ones, such as, say, tomato, eggplant, pepper, and other squashes even, those would really need to have that full sun. And you may find that you're growing in an area where you are getting much more shade than you were expecting. And so now you actually need to be able to move it, which can be the benefit with that container, is you can move it around. You should expect to use a fertilizer this season, and that may be the challenge that you've run into previously, is that um, you were growing in this growing media, this potting mix, and yet you did not have any NPK whatsoever in that mix, or it was very, very low. So check your mix to see if the fertilizer is included, because you may find it's not included, or as I shared with my growing media, there's nothing. There's barely anything in there. There's two recommendations for container vegetable garden. It's going to be two fertilizers, really. There is kind of a slow release fertilizer in which over the course of a couple of months, you will get the release of these nutrients. And then there will also be a weekly or a bi-weekly fertilizer. The reason for the slow release is that many of them will have some additional micronutrients in them. So as much as we need our NPK values, our nitrogen, our phosphorus, and our potassium, you will typically find that some of your growing mixes in your vegetable containers, they don't have any of these other micronutrients that my plants really need. So you see here, this is a slow release photo here of one of them on the side, and it is one that will release all of these nutrients over a 6-month period of time. As I'm making my containers and I'm taking my growing media mix, I'm mixing in this slow release fertilizer. In this case, this is an Osmocote fertilizer, and it should be consistently releasing these over the next 6 months with it. However, you still want to think about a weekly or a bi-weekly fertilizer. And typically a good balanced one would be pretty good. A 10-10-10 would work really well. The other thing to mention here is you might look more towards a liquid fertilizer, one that's already in a liquid state, in order to allow for better absorption of the nutrients. Because you're going to be potentially watering every single day, you may find that the plant is not always consistently going to get, say, a fertilizer that is in more of a physical state, where it will actually kind of break down to the soil. A liquid fertilizer might be a better option here in that case. But both of those would be two recommendations, and they're recommendations that we consistently see in most extension publications from different universities, is having both of those fertilizers as options. As I made my containers this season, I was adding Osmocote, or a slow release fertilizer at planting, and now consistently I'm on a 2-week schedule of adding additional ones. It seems like a lot, right? You know, even as I kind of stepped back and thought about some of my planting, I was like, that's a lot of fertilizer I'm using. And the issue here is that some of the fertility is being washed out based on your containers. The containers naturally draining away and moving away, but also that these are, when you're watering too, you're also losing some of that as well. The other challenge you run into with a container vegetable compared to a field-grown vegetable or a raised bed vegetable is that you're really trying to replicate some of these chemical cycles in the soil. Because you're starting with a sterile soil mix that really doesn't have a lot of soil biology, a lot of these nutrients don't always have a place to go. And so they get washed out of the system and washed out of your plants. I agree, it seems like a lot. And I kind of looked more into it, and yet because of that watering that you may be having to do, you will find that some of this can be really lost with it. So what about troubleshooting that? You know, if you are encountering an issue, look at some problems. So look at what you could do. This could be drainage. It could be that you just not got enough holes in the bottom of that planter, or maybe the planter should have started off that day with a little bit more drainage to it. Look towards the sunlight. I think sometimes that can be a challenge that we run into, is that, you may find you're not consistently getting the sunlight that you really need. It could also be a container size issue, a mismatch of that container where there's not enough depth of that soil growing area or that planter to really be able to address some of what your plant needs at the time. You may find that you've planted too many plants and they now are competing against one another for some of the nutrients. At the same time, you may not be using a fertilizer, and that may be where you need to step in and kind of do a little bit more soil fertility here. As always, some of these are going to be in your control that season, and some may just not be. My first year of trying out watermelon in containers, I just kind of was like, oh, I'll do it together. Let's do a 5 gallon. Let's address drainage. Let's have a growing media. And I just wasn't consistent when it came to the growth of it. And I found that it got to a certain stage where it did produce a very, very tiny watermelon, but it didn't have enough nutrients to keep going. I also encountered that that 5 gallon bucket needed to be filled up much more, and also be moved around quite often for sunlight. So I found that just in growing watermelon in a 5 gallon bucket, there were a number of issues that needed to be addressed that I should have done that season. This is a source from Texas A&M, and this is one that you will have a link to this one as well. And this gets into some of the things that are consistently seen in container vegetable gardening. Plants that are tall, spindly, unproductive. You see plants that are yellowing from the bottom, the lack of vigor or poor color. You may find plants are wilting, although sufficient water is present. This might be a symptom where there's poor drainage or aeration. I've tried to include, what could be the cause, also what could be the measures that you do. Some of which you could do that growing season, some of which you may not be able to do much that growing season. And always keep in mind that sometimes these can look like different issues. It could be a disease problem, it could be an insect issue. There could be numerous things happening that could be causing sometimes some of these. But you may have encountered some of these previously, and you may find some solutions here at the side. Just be cautious of some of them when it comes to it. One of the questions that I think we get a lot of times, and did get this time, so thank you, Bruce, was root vegetables. How you're growing carrots in containers and you're finding that they're just not performing well. They're very poor, spindly, they're just not working too well for you. This would be the same for beets, the same for turnips. If you have spaced them as they should be and spaced them kind of correctly, some other things to look at, especially this season, might be to look towards a bigger container. And this could be that they need a better diameter, they need a better height, they need something that could allow them to really spread out and really grow much better. You might also decide to look at a cultivar or a variety that is not that 10, 12-inch Danver carrot that you're expecting to use. Maybe you really need to do something a little bit different. Look to also maybe create your own soilless mix. Maybe that's where the issue is, especially with these root vegetables that need more drainage and need to have more aeration. And this could be that 1 part of compost, 1 part of vermiculite, 1 part of perlite. Yet again, with that mixture, you would be also wanting to add in your fertilizer, a slow release, and a weekly or bi-weekly line. And also ensure that the fertility is being addressed. Typically with root vegetables, you may notice some yellowing of leaves, and that could tell you that you probably have a nitrogen deficiency. The other thing that you might be running into is the container temperature. It could be that your container is heating that soil up too hot. Typically, when your soil for root vegetables is getting above 77 degrees Fahrenheit, this may result in more spindly growth of your carrots. They may have grown really great for you throughout the season, but as soon as we got into June or you got into July or later on in that season, you may have a container where it's getting way too warm and it's getting way too hot for those roots to really develop. And that's resulting in spindly growth. So the solution may be to provide some shade in parts of that day, or to provide some area to really keep it from getting as warm as it is. That may be what you have to do when it comes to it, is that the container might be just getting a little bit too hot for them. I think it's important to recognize that, if you've grown carrots and you've had issues with them in containers, you tend to not be alone. I think a lot of us run into that issue too. But I might steer more towards the container temperature issue and the actual soil temperature. So we're beginning to wrap up today. As always, I like to send you resources and include resources in today's presentation. So you will get the email with links to all of these. I do just want to mention that the container vegetable overviews are a lot, and I recognize that. And you will find some consistency, and you'll also find some inconsistency when it comes to it. A couple of things to just mention within this. The Minnesota has some 2 recent guides on container vegetables from 2019 as well as 2020, which I really liked. Very good kind of brief overviews. I love the handout, Can I Grow That Here, from Montana State, and it has an entire container vegetable column with recommendations. So you'll get that in your email today too. I have utilized some successful container gardening from University of Illinois Extension. This is a website that we maintain. However, it is a little bit old and you may not find as consistent information there too. Our colleague Andrew Holsinger, a horticulture educator in the southern part of Illinois, just recently gave a YouTube overview on creating accessible, edible vegetable containers. So fairly consistent information is what is in his along with mine. Today, you heard me talk about companion planting as well as trap cropping. Both of those guides from Iowa State listed here will be included in your email. There is Epic Tomatoes, which is a book that came out a couple of years ago by the tomato guy from Seed Savers Exchange. And he has a couple of pages in there that actually get into growing tomatoes in containers. And some of his guidance and best practices are included there. So that would be a great book to add to the bookshelf and kind of give you a bit of an overview too. So as we get wrapped up today, certainly think about choosing the right container, consider that cultivar variety and think about that growing media. But also recognize that you need fertilizers in most cases and you need a new growing media every single year. And you may also find that this is going to be the summer of experimentation. That's what I try to do with my container vegetables is try to experiment, push the limits, see how things work, and try out just lots of different containers. You may also find that this is a year that you're going to use different soil mixes. That may be, or soil is media mix rather. This could be what the challenge was and the issue you ran into. With it. But explore different cultivars varieties. I've got a number of different containers I'm growing this year, lots of different varieties and cultivars I'm trying out to see how they perform. And I try to also grow one of them in a container and grow another one in the soil to see what yields can look like. And that might be what you decide to do too. Next week is going to be our last Get Growing webinar on herbs and others, others being kind of tea gardens and kind of other things too. So you will find a link for that on our website to register. So as always, this is my email, this is my phone number. We have a Facebook and try to be pretty good about updating it. And that's usually where you can find information on if there's any upcoming YouTube videos that have been uploaded or other webinars that are happening throughout the state. You will get an email with an evaluation and always appreciate you filling that out as it really guides programming and helps us determining what the needs are and where we might be going forward with our webinars in the future. So you can take a photo with your camera phone right now and that will take you to the survey or expect to have that. All right, so I've got some time and let's get through some questions then. All right, Kara. So Kara, Kara had a question about squirrels and possums and coons to discourage them. I've got your email address, Kara, and I will send you kind of the handout from last week that will go into pest management of squirrels and possums and raccoons, because we did just cover that, and I am about to upload that YouTube video as well. Someone did recommend cut chicken wire, and that has been recommended as well too, as a way to kind of control them and deal with that. But I will certainly make sure that you get that handout as well as a link to that YouTube video that's up there. Victoria asked, how do you hill up? So the hilling process is kind of where you're hilling up, removing soil up to kind of the entire, you're hilling up the potato, you're moving in soil, and you're raising up that soil. And so you're trying to consistently make sure that you just have a little bit of growth of that potato showing at one time. That's usually about 1 inch of soil or your growing media that's added. You notice with my potatoes that I'm growing in those containers, I do not have any excess soil media or any excess soil. So I actually need to bring my growing media in, hill them up to where just about 1 inch of the potato is growing. And then from there, I need to increase the size of my growing bag. So that's kind of the hilling process. And this happens about 6 to 7 inches of growth. So some of my potatoes are right there where they need to be hilled up. Other ones are just not there yet. So I need to wait a little bit more with that. Yours may be there, I don't know. So question, I noticed in the picture you're not filling the containers all the way. Is there a reason for that? Yes, that was kind of a challenge that I was noticing, is that I'm a little inconsistent with some of that. And some of it was just to see if it could potentially work to not fill it up. Some of the other challenge I run into, especially with some of the fabric bags, is that as you fill them up, they can get pretty heavy. So I was trying to just kind of think, okay, 8 to 10 inches in depth, could that work for me? But be a little mindful of that, making sure that the depth is it. I think this is a place where it's do as I say, not as I do, Kathleen. And I will try to be better as well. Jerry suggested dwarf tomatoes for containers. Yep, I agree. Very good. He does the 200-pound bag, 200 bags in his driveway. Such beautiful photos. By raised up, do you mean pulling it up and replanting it every time? So with the raised up, kind of the containers, I was kind of talking about putting more soil in there and kind of raising that up to kind of create a bit more of a, raised up, I was kind of talking about the sides of the bags need to be raised up a little bit more. So kind of unrolling them and raising them up is kind of what I was after there. So not replanting every time, but just kind of pulling up the sides and adding more soil to it, or adding more soilless media to it. Right. So yeah, like Kathleen said, I need to kind of raise up, add more soil, kind of get it raised up a little bit more. I'm probably going to cover some of the lower limbs as well with it too. Sorry about the inconsistency there. Question, would you mulch to reduce water needs? If so, what mulch would be best? Just as you grow tomatoes, just as you grow some of these other plants, if it is something that would do really well with mulching, I would still try to do that. So for some of my tomatoes that I'm growing, I'm still going to try to mulch around them and put some kind of straw mulch layer in place. The other option that you might do is that if you were growing sweet potatoes, for instance, you could do a plastic mulch on that container growing area, and that could potentially help when it comes to increasing that soil temperature. But certainly if it's a plant that would really benefit from growing in a mulch, and what we might recommend for mulch, especially for something like blossom enrod, it would be very beneficial to do that. Typically it's going to be kind of a straw mulch. A leaf mulch might also work. You could also use grass clippings, but you certainly want to make sure that none of your grass clippings have been treated by any lawn care service, or you're at least aware of what that treatment might have been used for too. Jerry suggested in our chat box today, kind of just some different things that he does. He uses vacuum cleaner bottoms that have been discarded and cleaned for some of growing hydroponically. He also has about 9 plants growing in there in kind of that grow box, earth box. He also has another friend who has a bit of an earth box, similar situation, kind of a self-watering with a floating system. And then he tends to hook it up to a rain barrel for that self-watering. Great suggestion. Compost tea, a good fertilizer. Compost tea is one where we sometimes see mixed results as far as its consistency. It is always one where you want to make sure that your compost has been tested and gone through its usage, but it may not fully give you everything that you need for your growing medium mix. This is something where compost has very small NPK values that you're better off typically with a standard fertilizer already in the right chemical state. Just because in a container vegetable gardening, we're already trying to replicate some of the soil biology, and it's just not there yet. Versus if I use compost tea or use compost in my regular growing area, I would have a soil biological community that's kind of ready to go. So I would steer more towards a fertilizer that's already in the right chemical state to be utilized for the container vegetables. So Deb did a follow-up. Am I correct that you suggest when using slow-release fertilizer, you should also use weekly or biweekly fertilizers? Yes, that is the recommendation here. And the reason is that the slow release may not consistently give the vegetable in the container everything that it needs on a weekly basis. The benefit is the slow release is going to have some fertilizers of micronutrients like magnesium and sulfur and other ones that the plant needs, but it's not going to be consistently giving that NPK that your vegetables really need. And this was something I was a little unsure about too, Deb, and as I looked through the literature and kind of the other documents, they were all pretty consistent. You know, a slow release is recommended, and then also doing a weekly or bi-weekly to help with this. And you will lose some based on your watering. Question, is it okay to put last year's potting media into the compost pile, or what would you suggest do with it? That would be fine to put that potting media in your compost pile. You could also put it back into a garden area. You could also put it in another part of your growing area too. You would find that it would work pretty well to utilize it. So it would still have some benefits. It's just the challenge with it going from the container into another container, or now going from a different plant to this year's plant, is that it's just not going to perform well for you. And the issues you ran into, potentially you ran into last summer, might be showing up, or this could be something you encounter this season. We want to put you on a good path. All right, there was a follow-up. Yes, so yes, can you please send the squirrel, possum, raccoon handout to all of us? Yep, I will make that available to you all. You will get that along with the link to the YouTube channel where we are uploading last week's. Question, would mulching container plants help keep them either cooler or warmer? Typically, mulching can help kind of keep them a little bit warmer. It tends to kind of help make sure that the soil is covered and has them a little bit more consistent. You may sometimes see it be a little bit cooler, especially if you're growing in a garden or soil area, but especially in maybe a container, you're going to find that it should keep them a little bit warmer. There was a question in my email before we got started today. You know, an individual has 4 different squash plants. They have a bush, a patty pan, and a cucumber, and then they have different widths. They have a width that is 19 inches wide by 20 inches deep. They have another container that's about 20 inches wide by 17 inches deep. You know, as I looked at some of the cultivars that you were mentioning, Patricia, the bush is going to probably work pretty well for the smaller width ones, one where it's a 19-inch width, where maybe you could get in 2 plants there if you're spacing them about 8 to 10 inches. Some of the other ones are consistently going to be about 1 per pot, I believe, 1 per plant. I'll follow up with you as well if you're still on the call. So I've got 11:30. Any additional questions today? All right, so you got my email, you got my phone. Anything I can do for you, more than happy to. You'll get a couple emails today with different things, but otherwise, it's sunny where I'm at. I hope it is sunny where you're at, and you can get out and enjoy your vegetable garden and have a good weekend.